From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Tuesday, July 14th, 2015. Greece and Germany strike a deal. We'll navigate the ins and outs of the austerity versus democracy debate with my guest Harry Konstantinidis. And the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum features James Bamford. Plus, 6 years after the U.S.-backed coup in Honduras, we'll examine how democracy has been subverted and the ways in which people are fighting back. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
President Obama this morning announced a historic agreement with Iran after days of talks in Vienna with representatives from 5 other nations. Mr. Obama lauded it as, quote, a comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. The deal restricts how much nuclear fuel Iran can have, which amounts to the country having to reduce its current stockpile by 98%. It also reduces by 2/3 how many centrifuges can remain operating. Secretary of State John Kerry, who led the negotiations, said Iran will not produce or acquire highly enriched uranium or plutonium for at least 15 years. The detail will now have to be ratified by the GOP-dominated Congress, which may prove to be an even bigger challenge for Obama than international negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who seems to have greater sway over Congress than Obama, denounced the deal, saying, quote, today a terrorist nuclear superpower is born, and it will go down as one of the darkest days in world history. Both the U.S. and Israel have major stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Well, Bob, with all of this work that Kerry and Obama put into this deal, is it going to go to waste as soon as the deal hits the U.S. Congress for a vote?
Well, we know there's a segment of the Republican Party heavily represented in Congress that rejects anything Obama does. We know there's a wing of the Republican Party heavily represented in Congress that rejects any sane approach to politics in the Middle East. Put those two things together and it doesn't spell for an easy road for this deal. You know, I think it's still not clear whether Congress is going to finally give in, but we should step back and remember that any progress in the Middle East, a place where progress is sorely needed, is going to require Iranian and U.S. Collaboration. And this is the first step toward that. We can't solve problems or even contribute to solving problems in places like Iraq and Syria if the Iranians aren't part of the deal. Maybe some people in Congress don't like that, but that's reality. And this nuclear deal is a first step toward acknowledging that reality.
Just days before the one-year anniversary of the violent chokehold death of Eric Garner by New York police officers in Staten Island, the Garner family has accepted a $5.9 million settlement. The settlement does not include the admission of liability by the city of New York. 43-year-old Garner died after Officer Daniel Pantaleo placed him in a chokehold, which Pantaleo denies was a chokehold despite appearing on a bystander's video to be doing exactly that. A grand jury refused to indict him. New York has shelled out millions of dollars over the years to compensate family members of unarmed African Americans that its officers have killed. Meanwhile, in Ferguson, Missouri, which was a flashpoint in the Black Lives Matter movement last year, police continue to face protests, this time because a 16-year-old boy was shot in the face and seriously injured. About half a dozen people were arrested yesterday when they blocked traffic. Well, Bob, $5.9 million sounds like a lot, but is it really enough to compensate for the violent killing of your loved one?
Well, of course, no amount of money compensates for this kind of crime. You know, everybody understands that using the courts to win financial settlements to pressure governments and corporations to do the right thing is not a perfect method, but it's part of this system. So these kind of judgments do put pressure on police departments, on cities, to try and improve training and deal with this endemic racism that moves through law enforcement. That combined with the pressure from the streets, the Black Lives Matter movement, the long-standing movements to hold police accountable. We have one here in Austin, Texas. There are these kind of movements everywhere. The hope is that the pressure, the financial pressure that can be brought to bear through these kind of cases and the movements from the grassroots can start to shift this policy. It's not much to lean on, but these trial verdicts are important.
And the Black Lives Matter movement, by the way, just celebrated its second anniversary. It was formed right after George Zimmerman was exonerated in the killing of Trayvon Martin. Finally, President Obama, in a single day, doubled the number of prisoners to whom he has granted clemency. Commuting the sentences of 46 convicts yesterday brings his total to 89 people, which is still far fewer than, say, President Johnson, who granted clemency to well over 200. The move was in response to an ongoing project to reduce the number of people in federal prisons who are serving excessive time for nonviolent or drug-related offenses, particularly those people who, if they were sentenced today, would receive far less time. The Justice Department still has nearly 8,000 clemency petitions waiting to be processed, the result of a major initiative that it announced last year. In response to that initiative, advocacy organizations had launched the Clemency Project. They're disappointed by how few applications have actually been processed. Bob, how important is such an initiative, and can Obama keep his promise in the next year and a half to actually move through them significantly?
Well, to the people who've been released and their families, this is incredibly important, of course. The recognition through this project that there are another 8,000 is puts on the table the possibility of more. But we should also remember there's probably about, 80,000 or 800,000 people in jail and in prison who don't belong there, that the locking up nonviolent drug offenders, which was a clear policy, especially since the 1980s, has been an abject failure. It's a failure clearly on moral grounds. It's now obviously a failure on policing grounds. All of these things have to be kept on the table. You know, with Obama, a lot of these actions are better than you would expect from maybe a Republican president, but they're not adequate to address the problem. So we can celebrate for the individuals who are now released this particular victory and keep the pressure on for not only allowing a few people out, but really changing the policy on policing and prisons in this country.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Greece, Germany, and the European Union have agreed to a deal that will infuse the disastrous Greek economy with cash in exchange for a draconian set of conditions. Athens will receive nearly 90 billion euros in emergency funding. Among the conditions of the deal are the selling off of valuable Greek assets that could include some of its islands, natural preserves, and ancient ruins. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras has now been left struggling to convince his own MPs from the Syriza party to accept the terms of the deal. He may form a coalition with other parties in order to help push it through the Greek parliament. Meanwhile, former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis gave his first interview after stepping down from his position. He told the New Statesman about, quote, the complete lack of any democratic scruples on behalf of the supposed defenders of Europe's democracy. My guest is Harry Konstantinidis. He is a faculty member in economics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Welcome to Uprising.
Hi.
How much do we know about the details of the deal? There can't be much left to cut, given that Greece has been forced to accept years of austerity measures, but apparently there are cuts, and there are very deep ones, even worse than the original proposal from Greece's creditors that came a week before the historic referendum?
The truth is that you're right. There isn't very much to cut left. I think we have to try to understand the logic behind this deal, first of all. So I don't know if people have seen what the reaction from Germany or from Slovakia has been, but to some extent, this is a deal that is punitive in nature. The idea for several finance ministers in the Eurozone and for several European leaders is pretty much to bring the Greeks back in line and to make sure that no other people dare vote for a government that would like to challenge austerity. So Greece has gotten a deal that is a very harsh deal, a draconian deal, as you mentioned. It includes the privatization of 50 billion of assets. It includes further cuts in pensions. It includes further cuts in salaries. It includes increases in value-added taxes, a whole set of measures that the Syriza government promised to undo when it got power in January. So it's very much a punitive deal. It's very much a deal that is trying to make Syriza take back its promises and be discredited.
And this privatization and cuts in pensions and salaries, as you mentioned, if this was part of not only Syriza's agenda when it got power, but also part of what was rejected soundly by the Greek public in the referendum, what was the point of ending up here? What was the point of the referendum if the final end point was this one?
This is a very good question. To some extent, if you listen to the interviews that Yanis Varoufakis gave yesterday, both in the New Statesman and also in Greek media, I think we have a situation where the people may have surpassed their leadership. We may have a situation where the people, when they voted no in the referendum, some part, at least, of this no vote may have been an outright rejection of austerity. Now, to be fair, when the Greek Prime Minister called for the referendum, he did not run a campaign that no means a break with the Eurozone. So a no was interpreted by the Syriza government as a mandate to go back and renegotiate and try to show that he has popular backing in order to get a better deal. Now, it's very clear that what we euphemistically call the Eurozone partners used this as an opportunity in order to punish the Greek people. I think the best example being the Slovak finance minister, who said, the Greek people got their Greek Spring and now it's time to get an austere deal in order to learn the consequences of this Greek Spring that they had.
Wow.
So,
wow.
That coming from the Slovak finance minister would be a very strong statement. So you understand that we are talking about a complete rejection of democracy. We're talking about a complete disillusionment for those who believe in a Europe of solidarity, for those who believe in a Europe of democracy. And I think we're all learning very fast what is actually happening. Now, at the same time, if I may have 1 second, at the same time, it should also be noted that the Greek political leadership was not ready to actually campaign for an exit from the euro for a variety of reasons. And that's what we saw.
Right. So the threat to leave the Eurozone was in general a threat, although, as you point out, the leaders of Syriza never articulated that threat and very much paid lip service to wanting to remain in the Eurozone. German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble said some members of the Berlin government thought Greece would have been better taking a time out from the Eurozone rather than receiving another giant bailout. This may not reflect his position, but this is what he's saying that others were saying within the German government. What do you make of such an idea? I mean, I had not heard it even being floated before, that it was even a possibility to take a time out from the Eurozone. And I don't even know what that would mean, temporarily printing its own currency and then petitioning to return into the Eurozone. But what do you make of this idea?
I think this is partly, you see that there are some circles in Europe that would very much want to have Greece out of the Eurozone, right? And I think that this is an incredible suggestion. The idea that Greece could take a time out from the Eurozone. I think this tells you something about how the hardcore Austerian German establishment would like to see Greece treated in order for Greece to be made an example, in order for other countries to make an example out of Greece. The other thing that I think is important to note is that for a finance minister who insists on the rule of law and who insists on looking at treaties, I would be very curious to see the treaty that actually specifies this 5-year timeout from the Eurozone. To some extent, this is pressure for Syriza to leave the Eurozone yesterday. I think that the Syriza leadership was trying to avoid being forced out of the Eurozone on Sunday. I think they achieved that, but at a high political cost, and as we're going to see, at a high economic cost, because these are measures that will not work.
Right. Exactly, because no one's really talking still about the long term. There was an op-ed by Bloomberg published this morning simply entitled "Greece Should Just Quit," and in it the writers say the deal just announced only pretends to resolve their disagreement. That's why it won't work. Enough is enough. Greece should leave the euro system. The terms forced on Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras last weekend have little chance of being accepted, carried out and sustained by this Greek government or its successors. Greece's parliament may accept them this week because it thinks the alternative is worse. And in the short term, that may be true. In the long term, a deal imposed under extreme duress and bitterly resented by most Greeks won't succeed. I would add, it also won't succeed because there's no sustainability to this debt burden that Greece is carrying. That even the IMF admits that. So, do you agree that Greece should have called it quits and said, all right, we're done? Because in the long term, where will this deal go?
I think we have a political question and an economic question.
Right.
There are many ways to exit the euro. There are ways to exit the euro and to use this exit from the euro as a way to, as part of a productive reconstruction of the Greek economy. Now, let that be no secret, and I don't think that progressives in Greece would disagree with that at all, that the Greek economy needs serious changes. Greece is a country where shipping capital doesn't pay taxes. I mean, this is by the Constitution of 1975, shipping capital is exempt from paying taxes. Now, this cannot work, obviously, but it's impossible to always put the burden of adjustment on the poor and the pensioners who cannot pay anymore. Now, how would an exit take place? Well, this is a discussion that Greeks have not had yet. And it's partly startling to think about the fact that every other country went to this Euro summit with their Brexit plans, and the Greek political parties had refused to have a conversation about what an exit would look like. Now, under these circumstances, it would be very hard for a prime minister who was elected on the basis that he would stop austerity within the euro to come back from the Euro summit and to say, you know what, I just decided we're better off leaving the euro, even if that, in some people's minds, may be true. I think it's time to actually have this conversation about the real changes that the Greek economy needs right now. And given that everybody else is openly talking about a Greek exit, to also have this conversation about the way to make a progressive Greek exit rather than an isolationist, rather than a reactionary Greek exit. Nobody wants Greece to exit and become an isolationist state.
Right. In terms of the interests for keeping the EU intact, former Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt wrote in The Guardian this morning calling for the creation of an EU treasury, basically saying that the idea of the EU at the outset was flawed because it did not account for these sorts of financial crises. And he wrote, never again should the pensions and savings of millions of people across Europe be left to hang in the balance of an all-night emergency meeting with EU governments pitted against each other. Never again should the future of our currency be jeopardized in this way. What do you make of this idea to create an EU treasury?
First of all, let me say that my political and ideological background is very different from Verhofstadt, who is an outspoken neoliberal,
Of course.
in terms. But I think he's right that the Eurozone is flawed. I think he's right that the Eurozone could be sustainable, and we've witnessed the first crisis of the Eurozone, and not only do the economic and political leaders of Europe start implementing a disastrous set of policies, they also start pitting one people against the other. So we have seen this resurgence of nationalism, everybody pointing the finger at one another, rather than realizing that it's economic interests and class interests, if you will, that are guiding the Eurozone right now. Now, having said that, and I think partly here the US may be an example for us to learn from. Is it sustainable to have a monetary union without some fiscal and some political union? Probably not. Probably not. I mean, it becomes very difficult to do that. But I also think that it becomes more difficult to argue for a political and for a fiscal union in this particular time in the Eurozone. Now, the way that some of the bureaucracy, some of the Greek bureaucracy is being depoliticized effectively through this memorandum, through this new agreement, is an attempt to take away sovereignty. Let's not mince our words here. So, and that's something that the Greeks are having trouble swallowing, but other countries will also have trouble swallowing.
Now, let's talk about the challenges that Syriza is facing internally, particularly today and this week. While half the battle that Tsipras fought may have been waged over the weekend with negotiators, he now faces just as great, perhaps, a battle within his own party, which holds a majority of seats in the parliament. Is there a split within Syriza over this deal, and could Tsipras end up finding a common ground with other parties and forming some sort of coalition, which of course dilutes Syriza's hold within the Greek political system?
Good questions. The first, from what it comes out from the Greek news, I think it's pretty clear that there is a lot of discontent within Syriza right now about these measures. These are people who got elected on a platform to end austerity, and it's very difficult for the same people to actually implement these measures. And I also think that these are people who honestly believed that they would end austerity, and there is a moment of truth being forced to actually capitulate to this, to what was described as a mental waterboarding, and that's a strong metaphor, obviously, but this very strong pressure from the Eurozone to make a deal in order not to have the banks collapse this week. So I think that we are going to see a lot of discontent within Syriza. It's not clear yet what form this is going to take. It's not clear yet if people are going to leave Syriza. It's not clear whether people are going to vote no to the measures and then remain in the party. All this remains to be seen. Partly, I also think that the "this is a coup" hashtag became big in social media, and people realize that really this is a coup. I mean, this is an attempt to overthrow an elected government, which would become easier if a significant part of Syriza left the party right now, which would make Tsipras be forced to strike a coalition government with the neoliberal parties of Greece, which have been dying to get to the government for a while now.
Right.
So I think it's a tricky political situation. I think that obviously this is very hard for Syriza as a whole to swallow. I don't think that there is a right-wing part of Syriza that is happy with these measures that were implemented, but I think that there are some people who would not want to lose power over this. I think there are some people who would be willing to fight this while being in government rather than resigning and be replaced by a technocratic government, because it's pretty clear that the Eurozone powers are not going to let Greece go to election right now. That's the other thing. If we had elections right now in Greece, Syriza would come out stronger than they were in January. And that's a political paradox, if you will, but this also explains the desire of the creditors, and this also explains the desire of the representatives within Greece to just have a national unity coalition government, special purpose government, however you want to call it, a technocratic government that is just going to push through austerity and not go to elections, because this would perhaps move the electorate even further to the left than to the right.
Right. Well, some have even said that there's a possibility the Golden Dawn far-right party might benefit from more austerity. Do you have any thoughts on that very briefly?
I think this is a thought that those of us from Greece have been articulating clearly over the last 5-6 years. The Eurozone powers, the political establishment of Europe is clearly not worried about that. It's clearly not realizing, or it's clearly more worried about the left rather than the far right. Excuse me. So I think we see that Syriza is creating such an uproar. Even this rather moderate platform that Syriza ran under created such an uproar to the European political establishment, and the fact that Marine Le Pen in France and Golden Dawn in Greece and all these other misanthropic parties, nationalist, even fascist parties have been on the rise does not seem to bother the European establishment very much. Right. Clearly, in Greece, Golden Dawn is trying to get on top by saying that we are the only ones who are actually resisting austerity. Now, this is obviously a sham, and this is obviously an attempt to benefit from what is going on right now. But I think that this is a dramatic turn of events, and we have to seriously calculate it.
I want to thank you so much, Harry, for joining us today and shedding some light on this issue.
Thank you for having me.
My guest is Harry Konstantinidis. He's a faculty member in economics at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. As part of an ongoing series of interviews for the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we turn today to James Bamford to explain how the National Security Agency got so powerful. The NSA began in absolute secrecy. It's remained that way most of its time. How does an institution like that exist within the framework of an open society? And is it a threat to the very values it claims to be protecting? That's the question we ask in the interview today, produced by Brave New Films. The Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum features my interviews with a series of academics, journalists, and activists, and it's named after Henry A. Wallace, who was the 33rd Vice President of the United States. He served under FDR during World War II and ran for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948. He was known as a champion of the common man. Today's interview is with James Bamford. He is a documentary producer at PBS, author of several books, including The Shadow Factory, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America. We know the NSA has listened to our phone calls and spied on foreign leaders. But how did the NSA get so powerful in the first place? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The disclosure of the NSA's programs of mass surveillance shocked the nation and gave bragging rights to legions of conspiracy theorists. Here to tell us how the NSA became the powerful agency that it is today is James Bamford. He's the author of The Shadow Factory, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America, and The Puzzle Palace, inside the National Security Agency, America's most secret intelligence organization. Welcome to the program, James.
Thanks very much.
Well, why don't we begin at the origins of the National Security Agency? How did this agency begin, and how has it been linked to the rise of what we now call the national security state?
Well, the NSA began very differently from any other agency in the United States in the whole history of the country. Almost every other agency in the United States, the CIA and every other agency, it goes through a bill in Congress. NSA was never created like that. It was created in absolute secrecy. It was created by Harry Truman signing a top secret 7-page memorandum in 1952. So when it was created, even its name was top secret, and there were only a couple people, I think no more than 2 people in Congress, that were even allowed to know it existed. So it was born in absolute secrecy and has remained that way most of its life.
And so how did it come to be an organization that became acceptable to have in our political landscape? How did it go from being a covert to an open agency whose legitimacy we tend to take for granted now?
Well, it was gradual. It was top secret when it was born, and then there was a major investigation of NSA in the mid-1970s by Senator Frank Church. It was called the Church Committee, and they found massive abuses by the NSA. And after that, the NSA was fairly known to the public in terms of its name appearing in the press. And at that point, that's when the first attempts were made to bring some regulation to the NSA.
And then how did the 9/11 attacks prove to be a sort of turning point in the NSA's scope and its jurisdiction? How did that moment in history become used by the NSA to vastly expand its powers?
Well, after the Church Committee discovered that NSA had been illegally eavesdropping on Americans, it created a mechanism to sort of protect the public from the NSA. It was called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So from then on, anybody that at NSA that wanted to eavesdrop on an American would have to get a warrant from the secret court, the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. And that worked fairly well. The problem was after 9/11, the Bush administration didn't trust the FISA court, and so it decided to bypass it. And that's against the law. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act says that any time an American is targeted by NSA, they must go through the FISA court. So the Bush administration after 9/11 bypassed that law and began eavesdropping on a massive scale on Americans in the United States.
So given that the NSA's scope has expanded and of course funding has expanded in these years since 9/11, I think we should ask that question. It has been tasked with protecting us from another terrorist attack. Has it succeeded in this role that it has been given?
Just to give you a track record, before 9/11, NSA missed the first World Trade Center attack. It missed the attack on the USS Cole. It missed the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And it missed 9/11. NSA watched 9/11 take place in total surprise on the television set. And then after 9/11, it missed the underwear bomber, and then it missed the Times Square bomber, and it missed marathon bombers up in Boston. So even with all this extra eavesdropping, it still keeps missing everything. So no, I don't think it's been successful. There are a number of ways that NSA could really, I think, help in the terrorism fight against terrorism, but the way they're going about it by eavesdropping on everybody all the time is not the way to do it.
Now, the chilling effect that we have today with an organization like the NSA can be quite devastating. Tell us about the so-called national security letters. What are they? What does one do when one receives one? What can one do?
Well, normally if the government, if the FBI wants to get access to some records that you have, your phone records or whatever, it would have to get a subpoena from a judge. It would have to tell a judge that, look, there's a probable cause this person's involved in a crime. Well, what the national security letters do is it bypasses that safeguard. It orders that person to turn those records over, and then it orders that person never to say anything about the fact that they did turn those records over. So it's this very secret order that basically bypasses any safeguards. The safeguards being third branch of government, the judiciary system, where a judge can rule whether it's legal or not.
Now, these days, with some of the revelations that we've gotten about what the National Security Agency is actually doing, we know of a program known by its mysterious acronym PRISM. Can you tell us what PRISM is and how it might be impacting all our daily lives without us even realizing?
What PRISM is it's a secret cooperation between the major internet companies like Yahoo and Google. And what PRISM is the program that NSA will go into what's called the front door of, say, Google, and say, we want all these records on James Bamford, or we want all these records on this group of people, and they have to turn them over, and they have to keep it secret, the fact that they're turning them over. So that's what's known as a front door approach.
So given that they're collecting so much data, that there's this blanket surveillance, there are bound to be mistakes, aren't there? And what happens when somebody gets wrongly accused? What recourse do people have, for example, when they find themselves on watch lists, if they might have a name similar to somebody else's? What sort of power do ordinary citizens have over this enormous secretive operation?
Well, the problem is a lot of the people won't ever know that they're on a watch list, on a secret watch list. The latest numbers in terms of watch lists, there were something approaching 1 million names on the watch list. The real problem here is that the people who don't know they're on it can really be affected by that without their knowledge. For example, if they have a son or a daughter that wants to go to a service academy like West Point or Annapolis, they may make an application, and when that application comes in, the West Point, Annapolis, whoever gets the application may ask the intelligence community to look through its records, its logs, to see if there's any people on the watch list with this name. And if it turns up, then that person may not get accepted. Same thing if you're applying for a small business administration loan. There's all kinds of ways that you can interact with the government, and the government can secretly find your name on a watch list that may have your name on there accidentally, and you may suffer because of it.
What is the chilling impact, finally? What is the chilling impact that this program can have on journalism and also on political activism, and perhaps already has had?
Well, I think the worst political impact is the fact that there's so much invasiveness that the agency can do. In other words, if you're trying to contact a source, or a source is trying to contact you to report illegality or something that's really wrong with the government, something that needs to be reported, they'd be inhibited from that because they know that the NSA has this blanket surveillance, and no matter how they try to get in touch with you through an email or through a phone call, that because of this all-encompassing surveillance, they'll be discovered. So for a journalist, it really hurts in trying to expose wrongdoing in the government because people are inhibited.
James Bamford, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
How many countries has the U.S. invaded? On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, award-winning journalist Stephen Kinzer takes us through the history of U.S. interventions.
We think that we are really helping other countries by crashing into their affairs and trying to set them, as we would say, right. It's not up to the United States to sit in front of a map of the world and decide which countries are going right and which countries are going wrong and deserve American intervention.
And this week's episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum featured James Bamford, a documentary producer at PBS, author of several books, including The Shadow Factory, the ultra-secret NSA from 9/11 to the eavesdropping on America. And on Thursday, we'll turn to author Stephen Kinzer. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. It's been just over 6 years since the democratically elected president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, was ousted in a coup. Coming upon that anniversary, the Honduran Supreme Court decided to do away with presidential term limits, enabling the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, to run for re-election. It was exactly what the opposition that ousted Mr. Zelaya in 2009 had accused him of trying to do. Meanwhile, presidential candidate here in the United States, Hillary Clinton's role in the coup has recently come to light when she headed the State Department at the time of the coup. Newly revealed email exchanges show that her Assistant Secretary of State Thomas Shannon met with coup leaders a week before Zelaya was ousted. According to The Intercept, Clinton suggested using longtime confidant Lanny Davis as a back channel to Roberto Micheletti, the interim president installed after the coup. During that period, Davis was working as a consultant to a group of Honduran businessmen who had supported the coup. In recent weeks, an estimated 60,000 people turned out on the streets of the capital, Tegucigalpa, to protest President Hernandez's tenure and demand his resignation. The marches have been taking place every Friday for several weeks in a row. My guest is Dana Frank. She is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her writings on the post-2009 coup of Honduras have appeared in the New York Times, foreignaffairs.com, LA Times, Miami Herald, Politico, The Nation, and many other publications. Welcome to Uprising, Dana.
Thanks so much for having me, Sonali.
Now, you recently returned from Honduras. Can you first tell us about the street protests? How big are they? This is 6 years after the coup. What is the sense of what people want on the ground?
It's actually really an amazing moment, what's going on in Honduras right now, much to everyone's surprise, because there were, of course, huge protests for 2 years after the coup, but we haven't seen this kind of level of sudden uprising in the streets since then, and it's really a major popular outrage cutting across the political spectrum. It's about a huge scandal in which it has been revealed that of the $300 million were stolen in 2012 and 13 from the National Health Service, which had been in many ways thriving public health service, not available to all, but very upstanding. And it's now been revealed that $300 million were stolen from the National Health Service, and that was been known for a long time now, but that now there are documented evidence of checks confirmed by the prosecutor's office that hundreds of millions of that, or at least tens of millions of that, went to the re-election campaign of current President Juan Orlando Hernandez and other top officials in the government, and the party campaign fund was controlled by the current vice president and other top officials. So it implicates not only President Juan Orlando Hernandez, but the Attorney General, who has had the evidence for a year and not prosecuted. It implicates the President of Congress, who was the current President of Congress, who was head of committee with oversight of the funds, and it implicates the vice president. And so it's really a top to bottom corruption scandal, and people are really outraged because it's been documented that as many as 3,000 people have died because of the destruction of the National Health Service, and it's being used as a pretext for privatization. So these protests are led originally by a group calling themselves the Indignados, or the outraged ones, have been growing every week. They're up to 60,000 at least. I haven't seen the numbers yet for this last Friday. I myself saw 2 demonstrations on Friday nights in the capital in Tegucigalpa and 2 other ones, smaller ones, and they're really an incredibly beautiful sight to see. I have to say I was really deeply moved. Things have been so terrible in Honduras for so long, and here we're regular people. It's not even very organized. There's no speeches at the beginning and the end. Somebody says, here's where the march will begin and end this week. But it's regular people, and they carry torches, like the kind for backyard patio parties.
Oh, yeah.
Bamboo torches, and some of them are homemade by working people too. And they carry these torches, and they march at dusk and as it's getting dark. And I have to say, it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, to be going over a bridge and see these torches as far as you could see, blocks and blocks along the boulevard in every direction, and people chanting no to the dictatorship, out with Juan Orlando, and demanding an international commission on impunity.
And I want to ask what specifically that international commission is, but among those marching is former President Manuel Zelaya, right?
Yeah, there's all kinds of people. Zelaya has marched sometimes, but it's actually not, this is not led by Manuel Zelaya. There are all sorts of political figures across the political spectrum that are marching. It's very interesting because this is not led by the Resistance or Libre, the political party that Zelaya now leads in the second party in Congress, but it's actually people from the right-wing party, the new anti-corruption right-wing party, the Partido Anticorrupción. It's people from the Liberal Party, the remains of the old traditional right-wing party, people from the National Party, some of them wearing masks because they're afraid for their jobs, as well as people from the resistance. And it's really different from what we saw in the resistance, which was social movements, human rights groups, the labor movement, women's movement, campesino, indigenous movement. It's actually much, much more middle class. You can see it's a lot of people, you have the feeling that they've never demonstrated before. But the plot is also thickening because there's this hunger strike by some of the indignados, by some young professionals in front of the presidential palace. It's getting a lot of legitimacy and credibility, and now 7 Tolupan indigenous people from local Mapa, where a lot of indigenous people have been killed protecting their land rights. 7 of these Tolupan indigenous people have now joined the hunger strikers, demanding an end to impunity and to justice. And just in the last 2 days, a very prominent human rights figure and 2 indigenous Lenca people from Copin joined their prominent indigenous organization. A different group of people joined the hunger strikers. So it's getting much more broad-based and complicated, but it's certainly a very, very beautiful thing that no one saw coming. And so there's this incredible moment of hope in the long, dark night of post-coup Honduras.
Well, Dana, when you say a lot of middle-class folks and even folks from the right as part of this, immediately my radar goes up, because we've seen this sort of thing happen in, say, Ecuador and in Venezuela, where demonstrations dominated by, well, maybe middle class, but mostly upper middle class and upper class, and folks from the right whose simple banner is often corruption. Is any of that happening in Honduras? And I know you're sensitive to that.
Well, I was very watching this and thinking, what's going on here? But I actually do think it's more complicated than this. In fact, Greg Grandin had an excellent article about Honduras on the Nation you might have seen. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly, I think that there's some people that may even have supported the coup in there, but what everyone says, and I was down there talking to an enormous number of people who would be quite critical of this kind of right-wing anti-corruption protest, if that's all it was, were actually very excited about it. And there's now an agreement between the National Front of Popular Resistance and the Indignados to work together on this. And, I'm sure that there are elements in these demonstrations that are perhaps controlled by the embassy, hoping to come out ahead in this. But it really is against a government that's very much backed by the U.S. Embassy, and we can talk about that if you want. Right. But it's, it does seem to be, and this truly popular uprising in the middle class that's angry about the discussion of the health service. They're also angry about some taxes, which, I'm not sure that we might support these taxes, but the taxes are going to a corrupt elite that's just robbing the country blind. Because it's not just the thievery of the National Health Service. It's there are suggestions that there is documentation that it's all kinds of government bodies were just robbed blind to pay for these elections, and so also these middle class people are hurting financially, and their kids I'm told are dropping out of the university because they can't pay. So I think they thought that the coup would just pass them by, and now they're livid. And also there's an enormous amount of social media going on here, really new in the last year, that's breaking through what Hondurans call the media fence, and people are sharing reports about repression, and I think there's some sincere shock going on the part of young middle class people who didn't think they had to protest.
Well, if the corruption and the term limits issue is, given what I mentioned about the Supreme Court overturning term limits, this is what Zelaya was accused of. And this post-coup government seems to have arrived at exactly the same place that they were criticizing Zelaya of being, right?
Well, yeah, it's also really important to underscore that it's a complete myth that Zelaya wants to use a constitutional convention to try to get a second term. There's absolutely no evidence of that.
Right, they were just accusing him of that.
But certainly the day of the coup was the so-called cuarto urna, or fourth ballot box, to ask if people wanted to elect delegates to a constitutional convention. And then the right and the U.S. mainstream media picked that up and said that he was using it to try to get a second term. And whereas Juan Orlando very clearly has wanted to have a second term. But Juan Orlando's, there's a lot of very other terrible things he's done that you need to, when we talk about the re-election campaign, issue need to be put in context, excuse me. When he was in Congress, the Honduran Congress at the time of the coup, he chaired a committee that endorsed the coup, the completely illegal military coup. In December 2012, he was the leader of the so-called technical coup that overthrew the constitutional branch of the Supreme Court and named 4 Supreme Court justices loyal to him completely illegally. And they've made all kinds of unconstitutional rulings since. And he illegally named a new attorney general for an illegal 5-year term in the summer of 2013. And that court and that attorney general are now those exactly responsible for investigation into this corruption scandal. That's why people are calling for a completely independent UN-controlled commission on impunity like the one in Guatemala, because as people say, it's like the rats guarding the cheese. The government can't investigate itself.
Now, let's talk about what you were mentioning earlier, this demand for an international commission on impunity, which is what you're saying are among the demands of those people who are marching today. What exactly does this mean?
Well, people are modeling it on the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, known as the CC, that's been functioning for many years now, quite somewhat effectively. In fact, has led to the resignation of the vice president. And so people are looking for a way, like, how do you get out of this, right? The 2 proposals are a constitutional assembly, which is coming back again very powerfully, but also to have an UN-controlled international commission that would investigate impunity and lead to charges. In order for that to happen legally, though, the president of Honduras has to ask for it, and he won't. So his counter proposal has been a nationally controlled commission on impunity, which is, of course, again, we've got the fox investigating the chicken house metaphors going here. And he's then brought in the OAS and the UN advisors to help with the nationally controlled commission and saying we have to have a national dialogue. And this has been roundly rejected by Honduran human rights groups, by the protesters. But then you can also see U.S. controlled elements supporting that. And we have to say, what was the role of the U.S. in getting the OAS and certain elements of the UN to support that model? One interesting thing that just happened on last Thursday is the U.S. Senate committee, the Committee on Appropriations just passed the Senate version, not the final version, of the appropriations bill, and in it for state and foreign operations, and that in it contains $2 million for an independent commission on against the model of Guatemala, apparently, and that's then being represented in Honduras, misrepresented as the Senate giving money for the Honduran model. So this is very much the big core debate that's going on right now, is what kind of independent investigation will happen, if at all.
And Dana, let's also briefly talk about the expose by The Intercept last week that revealed the email exchanges that Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, was involved in, that showed her being in touch and her staff being in touch with coup organizers before the coup and even after the coup. She wanted to find a way to get in touch with the interim president. Will any of this in any way be picked up by the mainstream media, you think, and impact her presidency? Because this is very much the kind of role she seems to be quite open to doing or continuing the ugly U.S. legacy, historical legacy of undermining Latin American democracy if she is president.
Well, you can imagine my feelings about Hillary Clinton after having lived through the coup and had been reporting on it for years. And what's very, very interesting what's going on, because as people have said, there's all this attention by the Republicans to Benghazi, but the real outrageous scandal in Hillary's past, of course there are others, is this recognition of the post-coup government, ignoring what we have from a WikiLeaks that we've had for years now, in which the U.S. ambassador said it was unconstitutional, illegal coup, and said it was a military coup, and they ignored that at the time. So actually, in the last few months, there have been several articles, including one in Salon.com, before we had the new emails, underscoring all the things she did that we know publicly to legitimate the post-regime, treating Zelaya like a bad child for trying to come back to his own country. They were buying time until the elections of November 2009 happened, which were several months after the coup, so they could then recognize the outcome of the election and recognize a new government. And of course, that election was boycotted by all international observers except the American Republican Party's Institute. The government was not recognized by the OAS, and most of the candidates of the opposition withdrew in protest because there were no civil liberties. And it was a real, and actually in those emails, I find the most outrageous one is one from top political official in the Department of State at the time and still today, saying to then Secretary of State Clinton that that the Honduran elections are, and I'm not quoting him here, are a wonderful demonstration of democracy in action in Honduras. That for me was the one that really got to me. And I underscore that the same man, Thomas Shannon, people may not know about him, was just sent to Honduras last week as the fixer. He's a very top figure, up there with the undersecretaries of state, the second tier in the State Department, one down from Kerry, and that he's the big mastermind of an architect of U.S. policy in Honduras and Latin America since the coup. He was just sent down there and sent all kinds of mixed signals to the public about the U.S. Well, it's up to the Hondurans and whatever form of investigation against impunity that they want to choose. And that the signals from the State Department, also from the ambassador on the 4th of July party, which was on July 1st, stood there next to Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president, and said relations between the United States and Honduras are perhaps the best in history, which is a really spectacular signal that the U.S. is continuing to back Juan Orlando to the hilt, even though, they're not wild about him. He's their man.
And it'll certainly be interesting to see how the on-the-ground protests that, as you pointed out, are quite broad, how he might survive that or not, and what the U.S. will do about it. Dana, what's a good place for people to get accurate information, not just about Honduras, but Latin America? This is a question that confounds us a lot, particularly for those who don't speak or understand Spanish. Are there good English language news sources that you can recommend?
I think the Center for Economic Policy Research's CEPR in Washington, D.C. They have an excellent news clipping service, a Latin American News Review, which I think is really, if people are looking for the English language summary of all of Latin America, and they pick up really great stuff on Honduras. So the CEPR's Latin American News Review, you can get the weekly, it comes out every few days. I think that's the best source, and they do terrific work.
And we'll post that to our website, as well as a website for you at uprisingwithsonali.com. Thanks so much, Dana.
Thanks so much for caring, Sonali. Your show's so wonderful.
I appreciate that. Dana Frank is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and her writings on post-2009 coup in Honduras have appeared in the New York Times, foreignaffairs.com, Los Angeles Times, Miami Herald, Political, The Nation, and many other publications. And this is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor, research intern, and audio engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.